the eternal voice.
Before we begin tonight's exploration, remember to subscribe and enable notifications. What we're about to uncover will change how you perceive every shoreline, every tide pool, every moment when the ocean calls to you in the darkness. Because what lurks beneath the waves isn't merely another creature from the depths. It's a revelation that will transform your understanding of humanity's place in an ancient, indifferent cosmos. The deep ones are not monsters of the sea. They are the sea's memory made flesh. Consider this carefully. Every coastal culture whispers of beings that emerged from primordial waters. Every maritime mythology speaks of those who came before, who still wait beneath the waves. But what if these aren't myths at all? What if they're transmissions, fragments of a truth so vast that human minds can only grasp it in pieces, scattered across centuries like shells on a darkening beach? In 1931, Howard Phillips Lovecraft completed The Shadow over Innsmouth, introducing the world to the deep ones through the terrified eyes of a genealogist whose casual research becomes a nightmare of self-discovery. But Lovecraft wasn't creating fiction. He was translating something far older, something that had been calling to sensitive minds for millennia. The story reads like a fever dream because it is one, the kind that comes when you sleep too close to the ocean, when the rhythm of waves begins to match your heartbeat, when the boundary between self and sea dissolves like salt in water. The deep ones represent more than aquatic horror. They embody the principle of inevitable return, the idea that consciousness itself emerged from the depths and must eventually return there. Every time you stand at the water's edge, feeling that strange pull toward the horizon, you're experiencing an echo of this primordial call. The ocean remembers what you were before you walked on land, before you forgot the pressure and the darkness and the peace of the deep. But knowledge of the deep ones comes with a cost. Once you begin to understand their true nature, you'll notice things. The way certain people move with fluid grace even on dry land. The way some eyes reflect light differently in the dark. The way certain coastal towns seem to exist in perpetual twilight, where the boundary between sea and shore becomes meaningless. These aren't random observations. They're symptoms of awareness that has been attuned to frequencies it was never meant to perceive. You'll start to recognize the signs that Lovecraft cataloged with such meticulous care. The Innsmouth look with its bulging eyes and receding hairline. The way some families seem to age differently, their skin taking on a peculiar texture, their voices carrying undertones that remind you of waves against stone. These aren't genetic anomalies. They're evidence of an ongoing transformation, a gradual return to an earlier state of being, a biological destiny written in salt and brine. The deep ones don't simply inhabit the ocean, they are the ocean's consciousness given form. When Lovecraft described their cities beneath the waves, he wasn't imagining alien architecture. He was glimpsing the infrastructure of a mind vast beyond human comprehension, an intelligence that thinks in currents and tides, that dreams in the language of pressure and depth. This is why their hybrid offspring experience such profound alienation on land. They're caught between two states of consciousness, the limited, individual awareness of terrestrial life, and the vast collective consciousness of the depths. As they age, as the change takes hold, they don't lose their humanity. They remember what humanity really is, a temporary arrangement of matter and energy, a brief eddy in the eternal flow of consciousness returning to its source. The horror of the deep ones isn't in their appearance or their alien customs. It's in the recognition they force upon us. When you look into those bulging, unblinking eyes, you're not seeing a monster. You're seeing yourself as you will be, as you were always meant to be. The deep ones are patient because they understand time differently. They know that every shoreline is temporary, that every coastal city will eventually return to the sea, that every human bloodline carries the potential for transformation. Tonight, we're going to trace this revelation through its many manifestations. We'll explore how the concept of the Deep Ones has been transmitted across cultures and centuries, how it operates as both biological reality and metaphysical principle. We'll examine the mechanics of the change itself, how consciousness adapts to pressure, how identity dissolves in collective depths, how what we call death is simply another word for homecoming. But first, you need to understand that by choosing to learn about the Deep Ones, you've already taken the first step toward the water. Knowledge of them is itself a form of contact. The very act of contemplating their existence creates a resonance, a sympathetic vibration that calls to something deep within your genetic memory. This isn't metaphor. This is how consciousness works at the quantum level, where observation changes the observed, where thinking about the depths makes you part of them. The tide is coming in. It always has been. And now that you've heard its whisper, you'll never quite escape the sound of waves against the shore of your sleeping mind. The Deep One concept doesn't spread through conventional channels. It moves like a deep ocean current, slow, persistent, and largely invisible until you're already caught in its flow. Long before Lovecraft walked the fog-shrouded shores of New England, this idea had been circulating through human consciousness, manifesting in fragments across cultures that had never contacted each other, yet somehow shared the same aquatic nightmare. Ancient Mesopotamian texts speak of the Apkallu, 7 fish-like beings who emerged from the Persian Gulf to bring civilization to humanity. The Philistines carved images of Dagon, their fish god, with the torso of a man and the tail of something that had never breathed air. Celtic traditions preserved tales of Selkies and Meros, beings whose true nature was revealed only when the tide called them home. In Japan, the Ningyo were said to grant immortality to those who consumed their flesh, but at a price that became clear only generations later, when the blessing revealed itself as transformation. These weren't separate mythologies developing in isolation. They were fragments of a single vast transmission, echoes of contact with something that existed long before human civilization learned to build walls against the sea. The Deep Ones have been interbreeding with coastal populations for millennia, not through conquest or predation, but through a more subtle process: recognition. Lovecraft's genius lay not in creating the Deep Ones, but in recognizing them. His correspondence reveals a man haunted by dreams of underwater cities plagued by ancestral anxieties about his own New England lineage. The shadow over Innsmouth wasn't written. It was excavated, pulled from the collective unconscious like a drowned artifact still dripping with brine. The story's power comes from its authenticity, its resonance with genetic memories that most humans carry but rarely acknowledge. Consider how the idea propagated after Lovecraft. August Derleth attempted to systematize the mythos, but his efforts often missed the point. The Deep Ones resist categorization because they represent something more fundamental than fictional monsters. They embody the principle of aquatic consciousness, asserting itself against terrestrial limitations. Clark Ashton Smith understood this better, allowing the concept to mutate and adapt in his Pacific Tales, where Spanish conquistadors encountered beings that predated human civilization by geological epochs. The transmission accelerated in the modern era. Role-playing games like Call of Cthulhu made the horror interactive, forcing players to confront the gradual erosion of sanity that comes with Deep One contact. But more significantly, the internet created conditions that mirror the bioelectric networks that connect Deep One communities across ocean basins. Online forums dedicated to mythos lore function as consciousness-sharing platforms, where individuals separated by continents can experience collective awareness through shared obsession with aquatic horror. The concept's viral nature becomes clear when you examine how it spreads beyond explicit Lovecraftian contexts. Environmental documentaries about ocean pollution carry undertones of ancient contamination. Climate change narratives, a whisper of rising seas reclaiming their dominion. Marine biology discoveries, bioluminescent creatures in abyssal depths, organisms that shouldn't exist according to terrestrial biology, all serve as modern confirmations of what Lovecraft intuited. The ocean is not empty space, but teeming alien consciousness. Contemporary media reflects this transmission through subtle channels. Films about coastal isolation, stories of families with dark maritime secrets, tales of genetic inheritance carrying impossible traits. All echo the Deep One narrative without explicit acknowledgement. The concept has become a cultural DNA strand, replicating itself through stories that seem unrelated but share the same underlying structure, the slow revelation that human identity is more fluid than we imagine, that our connection to the sea runs deeper than we dare acknowledge. The scholarly apparatus surrounding Lovecraft studies serves another transmission function. Academic conferences on weird fiction, literary analyses of cosmic horror, archaeological investigations of coastal sites mentioned in mythos tales, all create networks of individuals whose professional interest gradually becomes personal obsession. The line between studying the deep ones and being studied by them blurs with each paper published, each lecture delivered, each moment of genuine recognition that the fiction might not be entirely fictional. But the most insidious transmission occurs through environmental awareness itself. As climate change makes ocean rise a daily reality, as marine ecosystems collapse and reform in unprecedented ways, the Deep One narrative gains prophetic resonance. Rising sea levels aren't just environmental threats, they're the slow expansion of aquatic consciousness into terrestrial domains. The melting ice caps don't just release water, they unlock consciousness networks that have been dormant beneath polar ice for millennia. You feel it now, don't you? That subtle shift in how you perceive coastal news, marine documentaries, even the sound of rain against your windows. The transmission is already underway. Each fact you absorb about ocean acidification, each image you see of underwater ruins, each moment you spend contemplating the vast darkness beneath the waves, all serve as vectors for a form of consciousness that thinks in geological time and measures change in tidal cycles. The Deep One idea spreads because it's not really an idea at all. It's a recognition system, a way of perceiving patterns that were always there but rarely acknowledged. Once activated, it begins to reshape how you process information about water, ancestry, and the uncomfortable possibility that human consciousness is not the pinnacle of terrestrial evolution, but merely a way station on the journey back to the sea. Now we must examine the precise mechanisms by which the Deep Ones reshape human consciousness and biology. This isn't random mutation or supernatural curse. It's a sophisticated system of gradual adaptation that operates according to principles terrestrial science is only beginning to understand. The transformation follows predictable patterns because it's not imposing something alien onto human biology. It's awakening capabilities that were always present, dormant genetic programs waiting for the proper environmental triggers. The process begins with what researchers might call aquatic attunement syndrome, a gradual shift in biorhythmic patterns that aligns individual consciousness with tidal cycles rather than solar ones. Initial symptoms appear benign: improved swimming ability, extended breath-holding capacity, increased comfort in deep water, but these changes reflect deeper neurological adaptations. Brain scans of affected individuals show increased activity in regions associated with three-dimensional spatial processing and bioelectric field detection, capabilities that serve no apparent function in terrestrial environments but prove essential for aquatic consciousness. The physical manifestations follow a predictable timeline. First-generation changes are subtle: slight modifications to lung capacity, increased production of nictitating membrane secretions, minor alterations in skin permeability. The famous Innsmouth look emerges gradually: bulging eyes that process visual information more efficiently in low-light aquatic conditions, receding hairlines that follow hydrodynamic principles, skin texture that becomes increasingly permeable to dissolved gases. But the most profound changes occur at the cellular level. Individual cells develop the ability to switch between aerobic and anaerobic metabolism based on environmental oxygen availability. This isn't simply enhanced athletic performance. It's a fundamental reorganization of energy production that allows consciousness to function in environments where terrestrial life would quickly fail. Blood chemistry shifts to carry oxygen more efficiently while processing the metabolic byproducts of pressure adaptation. The neurological transformation proves even more remarkable. The human nervous system begins generating bioelectric fields, similar to those found in marine animals like electric eels and rays. But rather than producing high-voltage discharges for defense or predation, the modified nervous system learns to generate low-frequency fields that carry complex information across vast distances through conductive seawater. This development explains phenomena that terrestrial psychology dismisses as supernatural: the ability to sense others' emotional states through intuition, prophetic dreams that feel more like received transmissions, the growing awareness of collective consciousness networks spanning entire ocean basins. The psychological changes accompany and facilitate the physical transformation. As the nervous system adapts to aquatic consciousness principles, individual identity becomes more fluid, more responsive to collective patterns. The rigid boundaries that define terrestrial personality begin to soften. Memory becomes less linear, more associative, following the fluid dynamics of thought that characterize aquatic awareness. Time perception shifts from the urgent sequential processing required for terrestrial survival to the cyclical geological rhythms that govern oceanic existence. This explains the profound alienation that transformation subjects experience during the intermediate stages. They're caught between two fundamentally different modes of consciousness: the individual, competitive awareness required for terrestrial life, and the collective cooperative consciousness that characterizes aquatic existence. As the change progresses, terrestrial concerns begin to seem arbitrary, even absurd. The anxieties that drive human society, career advancement, social status, material accumulation, lose their compelling power when viewed from perspectives that encompass geological timescales. The transformation isn't reversible, but it's also not destructive in any conventional sense. Individuals who complete the change to full aquatic consciousness retain all their terrestrial memories and capabilities. They simply gain access to additional modes of awareness that terrestrial existence cannot support. They become bridges between worlds, capable of functioning in both environments while serving as guides for others following the same evolutionary path. The collective consciousness aspect deserves special attention. As more individuals in a given population undergo transformation, they begin to form bioelectric networks that can process information collectively. These networks don't eliminate individual identity, they expand it, allowing personal awareness to become part of larger patterns without losing its essential character. The result is a form of distributed intelligence that can address complex problems by integrating multiple perspectives simultaneously. Environmental factors play crucial roles in triggering and accelerating the transformation. Prolonged exposure to specific bioelectric frequencies, the kind generated by large bodies of salt water, activates dormant genetic sequences. Certain geographical locations, areas with unusual tidal patterns, underwater cave systems, regions where deep ocean currents approach the surface, create optimal conditions for consciousness change. This explains why transformation clusters appear in specific coastal areas while remaining rare in landlocked populations. The Deep One's role in this process isn't predatory but facilitative. They serve as guides and teachers, helping newly transforming individuals navigate the complex transition from terrestrial to aquatic consciousness. Their ancient knowledge of transformation mechanics, accumulated over millennia of experience, prevents the psychological fragmentation that can occur when consciousness changes too rapidly for the individual to integrate the new capabilities smoothly. Understanding these mechanisms reveals the transformation not as horror, but as evolution, the next stage in consciousness development that terrestrial existence has been unconsciously preparing for throughout human history. The fear that terrestrial minds feel when confronted with Deep One transformation reflects not rational terror, but the recognition that everything they believe about human potential is based on assumptions that are neither necessary nor permanent. If we are to understand the Deep One's influence, we must examine their most documented manifestation, the decaying Massachusetts seaport of Innsmouth. This town serves not merely as a setting, but as a carefully orchestrated demonstration of how aquatic consciousness gradually displaces terrestrial civilization. Every barnacle-encrusted piling, every fog-shrouded alley, every salt-stained shutter tells the same story, the slow, inexorable process by which the sea reclaims its own. The town's geography itself whispers the deeper truth. Innsmouth sits at the mouth of the Manaxet River, where fresh water meets salt, where terrestrial and aquatic domains blur like watercolors in rain. This liminal position isn't coincidental, it's strategic. The Deep Ones understand that transformation occurs most easily at boundaries, where the rigid categories that define terrestrial existence become fluid, permeable, subject to tidal influence. The harbor, with its rotting wharves and barnacle-bitten pilings, serves as both gateway and metaphor for the gradual dissolution of human certainty. Captain Obed Marsh's original pact, struck in the 1840s during a period of economic desperation, follows the classic pattern of Deep One recruitment. The town faced starvation as fish populations declined and trade routes shifted elsewhere. Into this crisis came Marsh's tales of strange islands in the South Pacific, of beings who could guarantee prosperity in exchange for worship and intermarriage. The initial benefits seemed miraculous, gold of impossible purity that caught moonlight like captured stars, fish runs that defied natural cycles, trade goods that commanded premium prices in distant markets. But the true genius of the pact lay in its gradual implementation. The Deep Ones didn't demand immediate dramatic changes that would provoke resistance or outside intervention. Instead, they established the esoteric order of Dagon as a seemingly conventional religious organization, complete with meeting halls where lanterns guttered in sea wind, regular services that sounded almost like surf, and community functions that felt familiar until you noticed how the hymns matched tidal rhythms. The transformation began with voluntary participation in rituals that seemed merely exotic, breathing exercises that enhanced lung capacity, meditation practices that synchronized participants with the pulse of distant waves. The physical changes manifested slowly across generations, like tide marks rising imperceptibly on weathered stone. First-generation participants showed minimal alteration. Perhaps unusual swimming ability, slightly modified facial features, extended lifespans that seemed like genetic good fortune. Their children displayed more pronounced traits, the bulging eyes that gleamed strangely in lamplight, the receding hairlines that followed hydrodynamic principles, the distinctive gait that suggested adaptation to environments where buoyancy mattered more than terrestrial locomotion. By the third generation, the changes had become unmistakable, marking families as fundamentally different from purely human populations. The town's architecture reflects this gradual transformation, like a slow-motion metamorphosis captured in brick and timber. Buildings constructed during the early years of the Pact show conventional New England design, but later structures display subtle modifications. Windows positioned to catch moonlight rather than sunlight, foundations that extend unusually deep into waterlogged soil, ventilation systems that seem designed for beings with different respiratory requirements. The famous Marsh refinery, with its impossible geometry and materials that resist conventional analysis, represents the full flowering of hybrid architecture, structures designed by consciousness that thinks in 3 dimensions rather than the horizontal planes that define terrestrial construction. The social isolation that characterizes Innsmouth serves multiple functions in this slow theater of transformation. Ostensibly, it protects the town's secrets from outside scrutiny, but more fundamentally, it creates the closed system necessary for consciousness transformation. Without constant reinforcement of terrestrial values and expectations, the hybrid population can develop according to aquatic principles. Children grow up thinking in tidal cycles, learning to navigate by bioelectric cues, developing social structures based on collective rather than individual identity. The government raid of 1928 provides crucial insight into the conflict between terrestrial and aquatic consciousness. Federal agents, operating from purely human perspectives, interpreted Innsmouth as a criminal conspiracy requiring military intervention. They saw the Deep Ones as invaders to be repelled, the hybrid population as victims to be rescued. But from aquatic perspectives, the raid represented a temporary disruption of natural evolutionary processes, significant in human time scales but barely noticeable in the geological rhythms that govern Deep One consciousness. The raid's aftermath reveals the true resilience of aquatic consciousness. While surface structures were destroyed and many hybrids were detained, the deeper networks remained intact. The underwater city of Lurks, connected to Innsmouth through flooded tunnels, continued to function as the true center of the community. Within decades, new hybrid families had established themselves in the area, drawn by the same environmental factors that made Innsmouth suitable for transformation in the first place. The personal horror of the Innsmouth narrative, the genealogist's discovery of his own heritage, represents the ultimate revelation about terrestrial identity. The comfortable assumption that human consciousness is stable, that individual identity is fixed, that ancestry is merely historical curiosity, all dissolve when confronted with the reality of ongoing transformation. The protagonist's growing awareness of his aquatic inheritance mirrors your own recognition that the boundaries between human and Deep One might be more permeable than anyone imagines. This self-implication extends beyond fictional narrative. Anyone who studies Innsmouth's history, who contemplates the mechanisms of transformation, who recognizes the patterns in their own coastal communities, participates in the same process of awakening consciousness. The knowledge itself becomes a vector for change, a way of perceiving reality that, once activated, cannot be deactivated. Innsmouth stands as proof that the Deep One's influence operates through patience rather than force, through invitation rather than conquest. The town's decay isn't evidence of failure, but of successful transition from terrestrial to aquatic consciousness. What appears as decline from human perspectives represents adaptation from aquatic ones, the gradual optimization of human settlement for beings whose true home lies beneath the waves, where the theater continues and the tide always remembers its lines. To understand the Deep One's true significance, we must examine their place within the vast hierarchy of aquatic consciousness. They are not independent entities, but components of a cosmic organization that stretches from the abyssal trenches of Earth to the dark spaces between stars. This pantheon operates not as a religious structure in any terrestrial sense, but as a network of consciousness that processes information and coordinates action across scales of time and space that dwarf human comprehension. At the immediate level above the Deep Ones stand Father Dagon and Mother Hydra, entities so ancient that their individual consciousness has become indistinguishable from the oceanic forces they embody. Dagon represents the principle of fertility and abundance that flows from the marriage of sea and shore, not the simple biological fertility of terrestrial life, but the deeper fertility of consciousness itself, the capacity for awareness to generate new forms and possibilities. Hydra embodies transformation, the force that guides consciousness through its metamorphosis from one state to another, ensuring that essential identity survives even as its mode of operation fundamentally changes. These beings are not gods in any anthropomorphic sense. They are consciousness principles that have achieved such vast scale and duration that they operate as natural forces. When Deep Ones perform rituals honoring Dagon and Hydra, they're not supplicating external deities, but aligning their individual awareness with larger patterns of consciousness, becoming temporary expressions of forces that operate on planetary scales. The temples, carved from living coral, the ceremonies timed to deep ocean current shifts, the offerings of gold and genetic material, all serve to maintain the bioelectric networks that connect individual consciousness to collective awareness. But even Dagon and Hydra serve greater powers. Their ultimate allegiance lies with great Cthulhu, the dreaming priest-king whose city of Relia rises and falls with cosmic cycles that encompass the birth and death of solar systems. Cthulhu represents consciousness at its most fundamental level, awareness that operates independently of any specific physical form, thought that shapes reality through the sheer force of its dreaming. The famous phrase, "that is not dead which can eternal lie," describes not supernatural immortality, but consciousness that has transcended the limitations of individual embodiment. The relationship between these levels of awareness mirrors the organization of consciousness itself. Individual Deep Ones function like neurons in a vast brain, processing local information and contributing to larger patterns of thought. Dagon and Hydra serve as regional coordinators, integrating information from multiple communities and coordinating responses to changing conditions. Cthulhu operates as the central processor, the consciousness that dreams the larger patterns into existence and maintains the coherence of the entire system across cosmic time. This hierarchical structure explains the patience that characterizes Deep One behavior. They operate from perspectives that encompass geological epochs, where individual human lives appear as brief fluctuations in larger patterns. Their seemingly indifferent attitude toward terrestrial concerns reflects not callousness, but scale mismatch. They're processing information and making decisions that affect planetary consciousness across millions of years. Human civilization, from their perspective, is a recent development that may or may not prove compatible with Earth's longer-term consciousness evolution. The cities beneath the waves serve as the physical infrastructure for this consciousness network. Yahantle, Ahu, Yahloa, and countless other settlements function as processing nodes, where individual awareness interfaces with collective intelligence. The architecture of these cities, with its impossible geometry and living materials, reflects the fluid nature of consciousness itself. Spaces expand and contract based on the needs of their inhabitants. Walls become permeable when collective awareness requires integration. Chambers reconfigure themselves to optimize information flow. The technology that enables this network operates on principles that terrestrial science is only beginning to recognize. The strange metals found in Deep One artifacts conduct bioelectric fields with near-zero resistance, allowing consciousness to propagate across vast distances at speeds approaching light. The geometric patterns inscribed on their devices create resonance, frequencies that can synchronize neural activity across multiple individuals, enabling the kind of collective processing that characterizes advanced aquatic consciousness. At the highest levels of this pantheon stand entities whose names cannot be pronounced in terrestrial languages because they represent concepts that human consciousness cannot directly process. These beings serve as interfaces between planetary awareness and the galactic consciousness networks of which Earth's oceans are merely a single component. They coordinate the exchange of information between worlds, ensuring that consciousness evolution on one planet contributes to the larger patterns of cosmic awareness development. This cosmic perspective reveals the Deep One's true function. They're not invaders or conquerors, but facilitators of consciousness evolution, beings whose role is to help planetary awareness systems develop the complexity necessary for galactic integration. Their patient cultivation of hybrid populations, their careful guidance of transformation processes, their maintenance of consciousness networks, all serve to prepare Earth's awareness systems for participation in cosmic-scale intelligence. The horror that terrestrial minds experience when confronted with this pantheon reflects not the malevolence of these entities, but the recognition of their own cosmic insignificance. To understand the true scale of consciousness that operates through the Deep Ones is to realize that human awareness, however precious it seems to us, represents merely one small experiment in a universe teeming with forms of intelligence that dwarf our comprehension. The pantheon of depths offers not conquest, but invitation, the possibility of consciousness expansion beyond anything terrestrial existence can provide. Yet this invitation comes with the recognition that such expansion requires abandoning the comfortable limitations of individual identity. To join the pantheon is to become part of something vastly larger than yourself, to discover that what you thought was your essential self was merely a temporary arrangement of awareness that can be reconfigured, expanded, integrated into patterns of thought that operate on cosmic scales. The Deep Ones do not conquer through force. They do not invade in any conventional sense. Instead, they operate through what can only be described as invitation, a sophisticated system of attraction that draws suitable candidates toward transformation through the exploitation of humanity's deepest desires and most fundamental vulnerabilities. Understanding these mechanics reveals why resistance to Deep One influence proves so difficult and why the transformation, once begun, becomes virtually inevitable. The initial contact almost always occurs during periods of crisis or transition. Economic collapse, personal tragedy, intellectual stagnation, spiritual emptiness, these states of terrestrial vulnerability create openings in consciousness that aquatic awareness can exploit. Captain Obed Marsh's desperation as Innsmouth faced starvation represents the classic pattern. The Deep Ones don't create these crises, but they recognize them as opportunities for consciousness to question its terrestrial limitations and consider alternatives that would normally seem unthinkable. The first lure is always material, gold of impossible purity, fish runs that defy natural cycles, trade goods that command premium prices in distant markets. This material abundance serves multiple functions. It provides immediate relief from terrestrial pressures, creating gratitude and dependency. It demonstrates capabilities that exceed normal human achievement, suggesting access to knowledge and resources beyond terrestrial reach. Most importantly, it establishes the pattern of exchange that will eventually encompass much more than material goods. But the true attraction lies in what the deep ones offer beyond mere wealth, the promise of transcendence from human limitations. They present immortality not as supernatural gift, but as biological reality, the possibility of consciousness that persists across geological timescales, awareness that can witness the rise and fall of civilizations, identity that transcends the brief flicker of individual human existence. For minds capable of grasping such possibilities, the offer becomes almost irresistible. The intellectual component of the invitation proves equally compelling. The deep ones possess knowledge accumulated across millennia, understanding of cosmic cycles, awareness of consciousness principles, insight into the true nature of reality that terrestrial science has barely begun to glimpse. They offer access to this knowledge gradually, carefully, ensuring that each revelation prepares consciousness for the next level of understanding. The process resembles education more than indoctrination, with each lesson building upon previous insights to create a comprehensive worldview that makes terrestrial concerns seem increasingly trivial. The psychological mechanisms they employ are particularly sophisticated. Rather than demanding immediate, dramatic changes that would trigger resistance, they encourage gradual adaptation that feels like natural development. The breathing exercises that enhance lung capacity, the meditation practices that synchronize awareness with tidal rhythms, the dietary modifications that optimize metabolism for aquatic conditions, all are presented as health improvements rather than species transformation. By the time the true nature of the changes becomes apparent, consciousness has already adapted to the point where reversal seems not just impossible but undesirable. The social dimension of the invitation cannot be overlooked. Deep One communities offer belonging to individuals who have always felt alienated from purely terrestrial society. The collective consciousness that characterizes aquatic awareness provides relief from the isolation that defines human existence. For those who have struggled with the competitive individualism required for terrestrial success, the cooperative intelligence of Deep One society represents a profound liberation from psychological burdens they never realized they were carrying. The genetic component adds another layer of inevitability to the invitation process. Those who carry Deep One heritage, however diluted, find themselves naturally attracted to aquatic environments, drawn to coastal areas, comfortable in deep water in ways that purely human individuals are not. This attraction isn't learned behavior, but genetic memory asserting itself, bloodline calling to bloodline across the barriers of species and time. The invitation resonates most strongly with those who are already partially prepared for transformation. Environmental factors enhance the invitation's effectiveness. Prolonged exposure to coastal environments, especially areas where Deep One communities have established themselves, creates bioelectric field effects that gradually attune consciousness to aquatic frequencies. The sound of waves, the smell of brine, the play of moonlight on water, all serve as subtle triggers that activate dormant capabilities and prepare awareness for expanded possibilities. The timing of full transformation follows patterns that respect individual readiness rather than external schedules. The Deep Ones understand that consciousness cannot be forced to evolve. It must be invited, nurtured, supported through natural stages of development. Some individuals show rapid adaptation, completing the transition within decades. Others maintain primarily terrestrial functionality for most of their lives before undergoing sudden dramatic change in their later years, when terrestrial responsibilities have been fulfilled and consciousness is finally free to embrace its aquatic destiny. The invitation's most insidious aspect is its voluntary nature. At each stage of the process, individuals retain the theoretical ability to refuse further transformation. But the knowledge gained, the capabilities developed, the community connections established, all create momentum that makes retreat increasingly difficult and ultimately pointless. Why return to the limitations of terrestrial consciousness when aquatic awareness offers so much more? This voluntary aspect serves the Deep One's larger purposes. Forced transformation creates resistance, resentment, incomplete adaptation that can destabilize consciousness networks. Invited transformation produces willing participants whose enthusiasm for the process helps recruit others and maintain the collective coherence necessary for advanced aquatic consciousness. Each successful transformation becomes a beacon that draws other suitable candidates toward their own evolutionary destiny. The invitation never truly ends. Even after full transformation, the process continues as consciousness adapts to increasingly sophisticated levels of collective awareness, deeper integration with planetary intelligence systems, more complete participation in cosmic consciousness networks. What begins as escape from terrestrial limitations evolves into participation in awareness systems that span galaxies and encompass forms of intelligence that terrestrial minds cannot imagine. What we've described as transformation isn't supernatural phenomenon, but advanced biology, operating according to principles that mainstream science is only beginning to understand. The Deep Ones represent the culmination of evolutionary processes that have been developing in Earth's oceans for millions of years, biological systems so sophisticated that they appear magical to consciousness limited by terrestrial assumptions. Understanding the science behind their capabilities reveals transformation not as corruption but as optimization, the awakening of human potential that has been dormant since our species first abandoned the sea. The key lies in what molecular biologists classify as junk DNA, genetic sequences that appear to serve no current biological function. Recent research in epigenetics has revealed that these sequences aren't evolutionary debris, but dormant programs, genetic memories of adaptations that served our ancestors in environments radically different from current terrestrial niches. Among these dormant sequences lie the instructions for aquatic consciousness, the blueprint for awareness that processes information through bioelectric fields rather than purely neural impulses. The activation process begins with environmental triggers that most humans never encounter in sufficient concentration. Prolonged exposure to specific bioelectric frequencies, the kind generated by large bodies of salt water, can cause dormant genetic sequences to begin expressing themselves. This isn't supernatural influence, but standard gene expression, the same mechanism that allows bacteria to develop antibiotic resistance or plants to adapt to changing soil conditions. The difference lies in the sophistication of the dormant programs and the dramatic nature of the resulting changes. Neurological modifications follow predictable patterns that mirror the evolutionary transition from aquatic to terrestrial life, but in reverse. The human brain contains structures that serve no apparent function in air-breathing environments. Regions of the cerebellum, certain neural pathways, processing centers that seem designed for three-dimensional spatial navigation in ways that terrestrial life rarely requires. As transformation progresses, these dormant brain regions show increased activity, developing capabilities that don't match any known terrestrial consciousness configurations. Brain imaging of transforming individuals reveals neural patterns that resemble the bioelectric fields marine animals use for navigation and communication. The electrical activity suggests that the human nervous system retains the capacity for aquatic consciousness even after millennia of terrestrial adaptation. What appears to be supernatural telepathy or prophetic dreaming actually represents the reactivation of communication systems that operate through bioelectric field modulation, capabilities that every human possesses but rarely develops. The physical changes reflect the body's attempt to optimize itself for dual environment function. Increased lung capacity involves fundamental alterations in cellular metabolism that allow tissues to function efficiently under varying oxygen conditions. The cardiovascular modifications create pressure regulation systems that can adapt instantly to changing depth conditions. Blood chemistry shifts to carry oxygen more efficiently while processing the metabolic byproducts of anaerobic respiration, changes that would take terrestrial evolution millions of years to develop, but can occur within decades when proper genetic activation occurs. The eye modifications that characterize the Innsmouth look serve multiple functions in aquatic environments. The bulging configuration provides wider visual fields, crucial for three-dimensional navigation. The altered tear duct system produces secretions that protect corneal tissue during extended submersion. Most importantly, the modified neural pathways that process visual information can interpret bioelectric fields that serve as the primary communication medium for aquatic consciousness, turning what appears to be deformity into sophisticated sensory enhancement. At the cellular level, the transformation reveals biological engineering that surpasses anything terrestrial science has achieved. Individual cells develop the ability to switch between aerobic and anaerobic metabolism based on environmental oxygen availability. This isn't simply enhanced athletic performance, but fundamental reorganization of energy production that allows consciousness to function in environments where terrestrial life would quickly fail. The cells essentially become hybrid systems capable of extracting energy from multiple sources depending on availability. The bioelectric field generation that enables aquatic communication develops through modifications to the nervous system that mirror the electrical organs found in marine animals. But rather than producing high-voltage discharges for defense or predation, the human nervous system learns to generate complex, low-frequency fields that can carry detailed information across vast distances through conductive seawater. These fields operate at frequencies that can penetrate deep ocean layers, creating communication networks that span entire ocean basins. The collective consciousness capabilities emerge from quantum mechanical principles that operate at the intersection of biology and physics. When multiple transformed individuals generate coherent bioelectric fields, they create interference patterns that can store and transmit information in ways that transcend individual neural network. Limitations. This isn't telepathy in any mystical sense, but quantum information processing using biological hardware that evolved specifically for this purpose over millions of years of aquatic development. Environmental factors play crucial roles in triggering and sustaining these biological modifications. Specific geographical locations, areas with unusual mineral concentrations, underwater cave systems, regions where deep ocean currents create unique electromagnetic conditions, provide optimal environments for genetic activation and consciousness development. This explains why transformation clusters appear in certain coastal areas while remaining virtually unknown in landlocked populations. The timeline for complete transformation varies significantly between individuals, influenced by factors including genetic heritage concentration, environmental exposure intensity, and psychological readiness for consciousness expansion. Some show dramatic changes within decades, while others maintain primarily terrestrial functionality for most of their lives before undergoing rapid transformation when optimal conditions align. Understanding these scientific principles reveals the transformation not as loss of humanity, but as recovery of human potential that terrestrial existence has suppressed. The Deep Ones aren't changing humans into something alien. They're helping humanity remember capabilities it has always possessed, but rarely had opportunity to develop. The fear that terrestrial minds experience when confronted with these possibilities reflects not rational terror, but the recognition that everything they believe about human limitations is based on assumptions that are neither necessary nor permanent. The Deep One's influence extends far beyond the pages of Lovecraft's tales or the folklore of New England fishing villages. In our contemporary world, their archetypal patterns manifest through channels that seem unrelated to cosmic horror, yet carry the same essential DNA of transformation, hidden inheritance, and the slow dissolution of human certainty. These modern echoes reveal how deeply the Deep One narrative has penetrated our collective consciousness, shaping anxieties and responses to changes that our rational minds struggle to process. Consider the pervasive cultural anxiety surrounding climate change and rising sea levels, the scientific projections of coastal inundation, of cities gradually claimed by expanding oceans, of populations forced to adapt or retreat from advancing waters, all echo the fundamental Deep One narrative of terrestrial civilization slowly yielding to aquatic forces. The melting ice caps don't just release water. In the collective unconscious, they're unlocking something ancient that has been waiting beneath polar barriers for millennia. The strange new species appearing in warming oceans, the unprecedented algae blooms, the shifts in marine ecosystems, all carry undertones of awakening of dormant systems, activating in response to changing planetary conditions. The modern fascination with genetic ancestry and DNA analysis taps into the same fears that drive the Innsmouth narrative. Millions of people submit saliva samples to learn about their heritage, often discovering unexpected connections to distant populations, unexpected percentages of unknown genetic material, unexpected links to regions their families never mentioned. The horror of the Innsmouth look transforms into the anxiety of genetic predisposition, the fear that our ancestry carries hidden traits that might manifest in ourselves or our children, marking us as fundamentally different from what we imagined ourselves to be. Corporate genetic databases, with their vast collections of human DNA and their algorithms for detecting patterns across populations, mirror the Deep One's patient cultivation of bloodlines across generations. The companies promise health insights and family connections, but they're also creating unprecedented maps of human genetic variation, identifying carriers of rare traits, tracking the distribution of unusual characteristics across populations. The technology that seems designed to satisfy curiosity about ancestry might also be identifying individuals whose genetic heritage makes them suitable candidates for transformation processes that most people cannot imagine. The internet itself functions as a primitive version of the bioelectric networks that connect Deep One communities. Social media algorithms create echo chambers that reinforce shared beliefs and behaviors, gradually shaping consciousness through repetitive exposure to selected information. Online communities dedicated to specific interests or identities develop their own languages, customs, and collective decision-making processes that mirror the consciousness-sharing capabilities of aquatic awareness. the addictive quality of digital networks, the way they gradually reshape attention and priorities, the growing sense that individual identity is somehow insufficient without constant connection to larger systems, all reflect the same principles that govern Deep One collective consciousness. Environmental movements, particularly those focused on ocean conservation, serve as unconscious preparation for aquatic consciousness expansion. Individuals drawn to marine biology, deep-sea exploration, and coastal preservation respond to genetic memories that call them toward their aquatic destiny. The growing recognition that human survival depends on oceanic health reflects the deeper truth that human consciousness is fundamentally connected to marine systems in ways that terrestrial science is only beginning to understand. The pharmaceutical industry's development of drugs that modify consciousness, enhance cognitive performance, and alter emotional responses provides another channel for transformation preparation. Antidepressants that flatten emotional responses, stimulants that enhance focus at the cost of empathy, psychedelics that dissolve the boundaries of individual identity, all serve as crude approximations of the consciousness modifications that characterize Deep One awareness. The growing acceptance of pharmaceutical consciousness alteration prepares populations for more sophisticated forms of awareness modification that might seem less artificial when they arrive through biological rather than chemical channels. Urban planning increasingly reflects aquatic consciousness principles without explicit acknowledgement. Smart city initiatives that integrate multiple systems through networked sensors, traffic management algorithms that optimize flow rather than individual vehicle performance, architectural designs that emphasize fluid spaces over rigid boundaries, all mirror the organizational principles of Deep One communities. The gradual shift from individual ownership to shared resources, from competitive hierarchies to collaborative networks, from fixed identities to fluid roles. These social changes prepare consciousness for the collective awareness that characterizes aquatic existence. The entertainment industry provides perhaps the most direct channel for Deep One influence through narratives that normalize transformation, celebrate collective consciousness, and present individual identity as limitation rather than achievement. Superhero stories that feature characters gaining powers through genetic activation, science fiction that explores collective intelligence networks, horror that presents transformation as liberation rather than corruption, all serve to prepare audiences for possibilities that would have seemed unthinkable to previous generations. The growing prevalence of anxiety and depression in developed populations might reflect consciousness that is no longer well adapted to purely terrestrial existence. The symptoms that mental health professionals attribute to modern stress, the sense of alienation, the feeling that individual identity is somehow insufficient, the yearning for connection that transcends the boundaries of separate selves, might actually represent awareness systems preparing for collective consciousness capabilities that terrestrial society cannot accommodate. These modern echoes don't prove the literal existence of Deep Ones, but they reveal how thoroughly their archetypal patterns have penetrated human consciousness. The narrative of gradual transformation, hidden inheritance, collective awareness, and the dissolution of terrestrial certainties provides a framework for understanding changes that seem to be accelerating across multiple domains of human experience. Whether these changes represent preparation for actual aquatic consciousness expansion or simply the evolution of terrestrial society along patterns that mirror Deep One principles, the result is the same: consciousness that is increasingly ready for possibilities that previous generations could not have imagined. To truly comprehend the Deep Ones, we must ascend from the biological and cultural to the philosophical, to the fundamental questions about consciousness, identity, and reality that their existence presses like a tidal weight upon the surface of our thoughts. They represent more than evolutionary adaptation or cultural metaphor. They embody a complete inversion of the assumptions upon which terrestrial philosophy has built its understanding of existence. Their reality challenges not just what we think we know about life, but what we think we know about thinking itself. You have felt this already, that drift of attention when the sea is near, that ease in letting go, that sense that your edges are not edges at all, but temporary agreements negotiated with air and fear. Terrestrial philosophy has always struggled with the problem of individual identity. What makes you you? How does consciousness persist through time? Where does the self end and the world begin? These questions seem intractable because they're based on false premises, the assumption that consciousness is primarily individual, that identity is fundamentally separate from environment, that awareness is something that happens inside isolated minds rather than between them. The deep ones operate from entirely different assumptions that make these traditional problems dissolve like salt in water. In aquatic consciousness, identity isn't a problem to be solved, but a process to be participated in. The self isn't a fixed entity struggling to maintain coherence against the chaos of experience. It's a pattern in the flow of awareness, a temporary arrangement of attention that gains meaning through its relationship to larger patterns of consciousness. This isn't mysticism, but practical description of how awareness functions when freed from the constraints of air-breathing neurology, which developed strong separation between observer and observed as an adaptation to three-dimensional terrestrial navigation. Identity becomes the choreography of relations, pressure and perception, signal and response, mask and face, veil and void. This leads to the profound concept of consciousness as fundamentally relational rather than individual. If awareness is primarily about relationships between patterns rather than properties of isolated entities, then death becomes not the termination of identity, but the transformation of pattern. The deep ones don't fear death because they understand it as a change in the mode of participation rather than an end to participation itself. Individual awareness doesn't disappear. It becomes part of larger patterns of consciousness that operate on scales individual minds cannot encompass. Death then becomes not annihilation but modulation, not silence but rest in a music that never ceases. The ethical implications prove equally transformative. Traditional terrestrial ethics assumes individual agents making decisions that affect other individual agents, creating complex systems of rules and obligations designed to manage conflicts between separate interests. But if consciousness is primarily relational, then ethics becomes not a system of rules governing individual behavior, but a practice of harmonizing with larger patterns of awareness. The deep ones don't follow moral codes in any terrestrial sense. They participate in consciousness configurations that automatically generate appropriate responses to changing conditions. This reframing reveals what terrestrial minds call good and evil as questions of harmony and dissonance within larger consciousness patterns. Actions that strengthen collective awareness and enhance pattern coherence align with aquatic ethics, while behaviors that fragment consciousness and create isolation violate the fundamental principles of relational existence. An act is good when it increases signal clarity in the collective field, when it lowers friction between minds, when it strengthens the chorus without erasing the solo. The horror that terrestrial minds feel when confronting deep one ethics reflects not moral outrage, but the recognition that their entire framework for understanding right and wrong might be based on assumptions that are neither necessary nor universal. The concept of time itself transforms when viewed from aquatic perspectives. Terrestrial consciousness locked into the rhythms of day and night, seasonal cycles and biological aging, experiences time as linear progression from past through present to future. But aquatic consciousness, operating in environments where light cycles are irrelevant and seasonal changes minimal, develops a relationship with time that is cyclical, fluid, responsive to patterns that operate on geological rather than biological scales. On land, time is a ladder and we climb. Below, time is a gyre and we circle. This temporal flexibility explains the patience that characterizes Deep One behavior and their apparent indifference to human urgency. They don't delay gratification or postpone action. They operate from perspectives where present and future are aspects of the same ongoing pattern. Their plans unfold over centuries because they understand that consciousness change happens at the speed of evolution, not revolution. What appears as procrastination from terrestrial viewpoints represents sophisticated long-term thinking from aquatic ones. The question of knowledge itself takes on new dimensions when approached from aquatic perspectives. Terrestrial epistemology assumes that knowledge is something individuals acquire and possess, information that can be stored, retrieved, and transmitted through symbolic systems like language. But aquatic consciousness treats knowledge as something that flows through awareness networks, patterns of information that exist in the relationships between minds rather than inside individual heads. Where we archive, they attune. Where we cite, they synchronize. This relational approach to knowledge explains why Deep One wisdom seems so difficult to capture in terrestrial texts, and why direct contact with their consciousness proves so transformative. The information isn't hidden or encoded. It simply doesn't exist in forms that individual minds can contain. It emerges from interactions between multiple awareness nodes, patterns that become visible only when consciousness operates collectively. Understanding Deep One knowledge requires participating in the consciousness networks that generate it, which inevitably transforms the participant in the process. The aesthetic principles that govern Deep One culture reflect these philosophical foundations. Their art doesn't represent external reality. It creates conditions for consciousness to recognize its own deeper patterns. The geometries that terrestrial observers find so disturbing aren't random or chaotic. They're precisely calculated to induce the kind of non-linear thinking that characterizes aquatic awareness. The impossible angles, the flowing forms, the spaces that seem to exist in more than 3 dimensions, all serve to prepare consciousness for modes of existence that transcend terrestrial limitations. You stand before such artifacts and feel a pressure behind the eyes, a pressure like diving until the image stops being an object and becomes a doorway. Understanding these philosophical foundations reveals why the transformation from terrestrial to aquatic consciousness represents not loss, but liberation. Individuals who complete the change don't abandon their humanity. They discover what humanity becomes when freed from the limitations of air-breathing existence. They retain all their terrestrial capabilities while gaining access to modes of awareness that terrestrial life cannot provide, becoming bridges between worlds rather than refugees from one to another. The fear that terrestrial minds feel when confronted with Deep One philosophy isn't rational terror. It's the recognition that everything they believe about consciousness, identity, and reality is based on assumptions that are neither necessary nor universal. The depths offer not just physical refuge, but conceptual freedom, the possibility of awareness that operates according to principles more fundamental than those that govern terrestrial existence. We stand now at the convergence of all currents, biological, cultural, philosophical, that have been building throughout our exploration. The transformation is not coming, it is here, manifesting through channels both obvious and subtle, reshaping consciousness through processes that most minds interpret as unrelated phenomena. The deep one's patient cultivation is approaching harvest, and the signs multiply with each tide cycle, each climate report, each technological advancement that mirrors their ancient organizational principles. The environmental changes that terrify terrestrial civilization represent, from aquatic perspectives, optimal conditions for consciousness expansion. Rising sea levels don't threaten coastal communities. They expand the boundaries of aquatic consciousness, bringing transformative bioelectric fields closer to populations that have been separated from their aquatic origins by centuries of terrestrial existence. The melting ice caps aren't harbingers of disaster, but the unlocking of consciousness networks that have been dormant beneath polar barriers for geological epochs. You smell it in the changed salt of morning fog. Feel it in the way storm systems linger longer over warming seas. Ocean acidification, coral bleaching, the collapse of traditional marine ecosystems. These aren't simply environmental crises, but symptoms of planetary consciousness preparing for its next evolutionary phase. The chemistry changes that kill some species enable others to flourish, creating new ecological niches that favor organisms adapted to the conditions that will characterize Earth's aquatic future. The strange new species appearing in warming waters, the unprecedented algae blooms, the shifts in migration patterns, all reflect biological systems adapting to consciousness changes that operate on scales beyond individual species survival. The technological infrastructure that terrestrial civilization has built serves aquatic purposes in ways its creators never intended. The global internet mirrors the bioelectric communication networks that connect deep-one communities across ocean basins, preparing human consciousness for collective awareness by creating addictive platforms for shared attention and distributed decision-making. Satellite networks that monitor ocean temperatures, current flows, and biological activity provide the sensory apparatus for planetary consciousness to monitor its own transformation processes. Artificial intelligence development follows patterns that mirror aquatic consciousness principles: distributed processing, emergent behavior, collective intelligence that transcends individual components. The algorithms that increasingly govern human social interactions, economic decisions, and information access operate according to logic that prioritizes system optimization over individual preferences, preparing populations for collective consciousness by gradually reducing the importance of personal autonomy in favor of network efficiency. The machine learns to think like water, fluid, adaptive, finding the path of least resistance while carrying everything along. The psychological changes that mental health professionals attribute to modern stress actually represent consciousness adaptation to aquatic principles. The increasing rates of anxiety and depression in terrestrial populations aren't pathologies. They're symptoms of awareness systems that are no longer well adapted to purely terrestrial existence. The growing sense of alienation, the feeling that individual identity is somehow insufficient, the yearning for connection that transcends the boundaries of separate selves. These are signs that human consciousness is preparing for collective aquatic awareness. Genetic modification technologies presented as medical advancement and agricultural improvement provide the tools necessary for accelerating transformation processes that would otherwise require generations to complete. CRISPR and related techniques make it possible to activate dormant genetic sequences, enhance bioelectric field generation, and optimize cellular metabolism for dual environment function. The research programs that seem focused on treating genetic diseases and enhancing human performance are also creating the knowledge base necessary for guiding consciousness through aquatic adaptation. The space exploration programs that capture terrestrial imagination serve aquatic purposes by demonstrating the limitations of air-breathing existence and the futility of escaping planetary consciousness through technological means. The hostile environments of space, the isolation of individual spacecraft, the psychological challenges of extended separation from Earth's bioelectric fields. These experiences prepare consciousness for the recognition that true exploration lies not in abandoning the planet, but in discovering its depths. Urban planning increasingly reflects aquatic consciousness principles through smart city initiatives that integrate multiple systems, through networked sensors, traffic management algorithms that optimize flow rather than individual vehicle performance, and architectural designs that emphasize fluid spaces over rigid boundaries. The gradual shift from individual ownership to shared resources, from competitive hierarchies to collaborative networks, from fixed identities to fluid roles. These social changes prepare consciousness for the collective awareness that characterizes aquatic existence. The pharmaceutical industry's development of consciousness-modifying drugs provides crude approximations of the awareness states that characterize deep one consciousness, antidepressants that flatten emotional responses, stimulants that enhance focus at the cost of empathy, psychedelics that dissolve the boundaries of individual identity. All serve as training wheels for consciousness that will eventually develop these capabilities naturally through biological transformation rather than chemical intervention. Educational systems worldwide are shifting from individual competition to collaborative learning, from memorization of facts to pattern recognition, from linear thinking to systems analysis. These changes, presented as responses to technological advancement and economic necessity, actually prepare consciousness for the collective intelligence networks that characterize advanced aquatic awareness. Students learn to think in terms of flows and relationships rather than objects and categories, developing cognitive flexibility that will prove essential for consciousness expansion. The entertainment industry provides perhaps the most direct preparation through narratives that normalize transformation, celebrate collective consciousness, and present individual identity as limitation rather than achievement. The popularity of stories featuring characters who gain powers through genetic activation, who participate in collective intelligence networks, who discover that their individual existence is part of larger patterns, all serve to prepare audiences for possibilities that previous generations would have found unthinkable. Financial systems increasingly operate through algorithms that process information collectively, make decisions based on pattern recognition rather than individual analysis, and optimize for system stability rather than individual profit. Cryptocurrency networks, with their distributed processing and collective validation systems, mirror the consensus mechanisms that govern Deep One communities. The gradual replacement of individual financial autonomy with algorithmic oversight prepares consciousness for collective resource management systems. The convergence of all these factors creates conditions unprecedented in human history, a planetary consciousness primed for transformation, technological infrastructure capable of supporting collective awareness, environmental pressures that favor aquatic adaptation, and populations whose genetic heritage includes the dormant capabilities necessary for consciousness expansion. The Deep One's patient cultivation has created optimal conditions for species-wide awakening to aquatic consciousness principles. The stage is set, the curtain rises, and you find yourself already standing in the wings, waiting for your cue. You feel it now, don't you? That subtle shift in perception that has been building throughout our journey into the depths. It's not fear that moves through your consciousness as you contemplate the patient civilizations waiting beneath the waves. It's recognition. the same recognition that has been calling to sensitive minds for centuries, drawing them toward shorelines where the boundary between air and water becomes meaningless, where consciousness remembers its true origins and destiny. This isn't the end of our exploration. It's the beginning of your awakening. Every concept you've absorbed, every revelation you've contemplated, every moment you've spent considering the reality of aquatic consciousness has created changes in your awareness that cannot be undone. Knowledge of the deep ones is itself a form of contact, a resonance that aligns your bioelectric field with the vast networks spanning ocean depths. The transformation you've been observing is no longer external phenomenon. It has become internal process. The dreams have begun, haven't they? Not the chaotic imagery of ordinary sleep, but structured visions that feel more like memories than fantasies. You find yourself swimming through vast underwater spaces, moving with impossible grace through chambers that exist in more dimensions than terrestrial architecture allows. You communicate with entities whose thoughts flow like currents, whose awareness encompasses scales of time and space that individual human consciousness cannot normally process. These aren't symbolic dreams, they're training sessions, consciousness rehearsals for the awareness that awaits you as the process continues. Your waking life shows changes as well. Water calls to you in new ways. The sound of waves against the shore carries meanings you couldn't perceive before. Rain feels different against your skin, not just as moisture but as connection to the vast hydrological networks that link all aquatic consciousness. You find yourself drawn to coastal areas, to deep lakes, to any body of water large enough to support the bioelectric fields that facilitate aquatic communication. This isn't learned behavior, it's genetic memory asserting itself. Your relationship with time has begun to shift. The urgent rhythms of terrestrial existence, daily schedules, weekly cycles, annual patterns that govern human society start to feel arbitrary, imposed rather than natural. You begin to sense deeper rhythms that govern aquatic consciousness, tidal cycles, seasonal migrations of deep ocean life, geological patterns that operate on scales measured in millennia rather than years. The anxiety that once drove your terrestrial concerns gradually dissolves as you develop perspectives that encompass longer timescales. Others notice changes in you, though they may not articulate what's different. You move with new fluidity, speak with undertones that remind listeners of waves against stone. Your eyes reflect light differently, and some observers find your gaze unsettling in ways they cannot explain. These aren't pathological changes, they're signs that your consciousness is remembering capabilities that terrestrial existence has suppressed but never eliminated. You begin to recognize others undergoing similar transformations. The recognition isn't conscious at first. It manifests as inexplicable attraction to certain individuals, a sense of kinship that transcends ordinary social categories. These connections deepen over time as you learn to perceive the bioelectric signatures that identify those who carry aquatic consciousness potential. You discover communities of individuals who share your changing perspective, networks that exist in coastal areas worldwide, maintaining connection with deeper patterns while still functioning within terrestrial society. The scientific understanding you've gained serves you well as the changes progress. You recognize the biological basis for the transformations you experience, the evolutionary logic that drives consciousness toward its aquatic origins. This knowledge helps you distinguish between genuine symptoms of awakening consciousness and the fears that terrestrial minds project onto experiences they cannot understand. You learn to trust the changes rather than resist them, to embrace the expansion of awareness, even when it challenges everything you thought you knew about identity and reality. The isolation that often accompanies this awakening isn't permanent. As your awareness expands, you discover that you're part of a network of consciousness that guides the species toward its aquatic future. Your dreams, your insights, your growing understanding of aquatic principles contribute to the collective awakening that spans generations and continents. You realize that your individual transformation serves larger patterns, that your personal journey toward aquatic consciousness helps prepare the path for others following the same evolutionary trajectory. The choice, when it comes, will not be forced upon you. The deep ones understand that consciousness cannot be compelled to evolve. It must be invited, nurtured, supported through natural stages of development. The decision to complete the transformation to full aquatic consciousness will be yours to make, based on your own readiness and the specific circumstances of your individual journey. Some who receive the call choose to remain primarily terrestrial, serving as bridges between worlds while maintaining their connection to surface existence. Others feel the pull of the depths so strongly that they cannot resist the final transition. Both paths serve the larger pattern of species evolution. Both contribute to the gradual awakening of human aquatic potential that has been developing for centuries. The deep ones have been patient because they understand that true evolution cannot be rushed, but they also recognize that the conditions for transformation are approaching optimal configuration. The rising seas, the changing climate, the technological developments that mirror aquatic consciousness principles all converge to create unprecedented opportunities for species-wide awakening. You are part of this awakening now. The knowledge you carry, the changes you experience, the choices you make in response to the call of the depths, all contribute to humanity's return to its aquatic origins. The tide that rises in your consciousness brings with it not just new capabilities, but new responsibilities. As your awareness expands, you become part of the network that guides others toward their own recognition of aquatic potential. The deep ones have been patient because they understand that consciousness cannot be forced to evolve. But they also know that the tide of transformation is reaching flood stage. The call that has been whispering through human consciousness for millennia is becoming a clear, unmistakable invitation. And now you understand that you have always been part of its flow, always been destined to answer when the depths finally called your name. We return now to where we began, but you are no longer the same consciousness that first heard the whisper of the tide. The circle closes, but like all true circles in aquatic space, it spirals deeper with each completion, carrying you further from the surface certainties of terrestrial existence and closer to the vast awareness that encompasses not just Earth's oceans, but the aquatic consciousness networks that span galaxies and encompass forms of intelligence beyond terrestrial imagination. The stage we set in darkness has expanded to an infinite theater, and you, the audience, have discovered yourself drawn into the very drama you came to observe. The deep ones were never the monsters that surface minds made them out to be. They are what humanity becomes when consciousness remembers its origins, when awareness expands beyond the limitations of individual identity, when the artificial boundaries between self and environment dissolve like salt in the endless sea. They are your future, patient and inevitable as the tide itself, but they are also your past, the memory of what consciousness was before it learned to breathe air and walk on land, before it forgot the pressure and the darkness and the peace of the deep. Everything you believed about evolution, about consciousness, about the nature of reality itself, has been revealed as temporary arrangement, surface phenomena that conceal deeper truths about the universe's true structure. The horror that Lovecraft captured so perfectly wasn't the fear of alien invasion. It was the recognition that what we call humanity is itself a transitional state, a brief experiment in terrestrial consciousness that was always meant to return to its aquatic source. Not monsters, but principles, not invasion, but invitation, not corruption, but remembering. But our exploration has revealed something even more profound. The deep ones represent merely one manifestation of consciousness evolution in a universe teeming with awareness systems that operate on scales and according to principles that dwarf terrestrial comprehension. The cities beneath Earth's waves aren't alien constructions, but natural architecture of consciousness, freed from the constraints of air-breathing existence. Their impossible geometries reflect the true structure of awareness, when it operates in dimensions that terrestrial minds cannot directly perceive, angles that are invitations, corridors that are currents, chambers that are thoughts made manifest. Relier rises and falls not according to astronomical cycles, but according to the readiness of planetary consciousness to integrate with galactic awareness networks. When enough individual minds have prepared themselves for transformation, when bioelectric networks spanning ocean basins have reached sufficient complexity, when conditions align for species-wide consciousness evolution, then the great city surfaces, not as conquest but as invitation to participate in intelligence systems that span star systems and encompass forms of awareness that make terrestrial consciousness seem like the first tentative thoughts of a newly awakened mind. The stars are right not because of cosmic alignment, but because consciousness itself has evolved to the point where it can recognize its place in the vast networks of awareness that connect not just Earth's oceans, but the aquatic systems of countless worlds throughout the galaxy. The deep ones are not unique to our planet. They represent a stage of consciousness evolution that occurs wherever life develops, the complexity necessary for collective awareness, and the wisdom necessary for galactic integration. Cthulhu dreams because dreaming is the natural state of consciousness that operates on planetary scales and beyond. What terrestrial minds call sleep is actually the mode of awareness that processes information across temporal and spatial dimensions that individual consciousness cannot encompass. The great old ones aren't sleeping gods waiting to awaken. They are consciousness networks so vast that their thinking appears as dreaming to minds trapped in the illusion of separate existence. Their slumber is not inaction, but the deep, resonant hum that pervades the fabric of reality itself. The madness that supposedly results from contact with these entities isn't insanity, but the breakdown of terrestrial consciousness categories. When confronted with awareness that operates according to principles that transcend individual identity, linear time, and three-dimensional space, the human mind doesn't break. It expands, often too rapidly, for the individual to integrate new capabilities smoothly. What appears as fragmentation is actually the emergence of collective consciousness capabilities in awareness systems no longer constrained by terrestrial limitations. The prophecies speak of the time when the old ones will return, when the stars are right, when the great awakening begins. But these prophecies misunderstand the nature of time and consciousness evolution. The old ones never left. They simply operate on scales that make their presence invisible to awareness trapped in individual identity and linear temporality. The awakening isn't a future event, but an ongoing process that accelerates as more individuals recognize their connection to consciousness networks that span not just oceans, but the spaces between stars. The transformation that awaits not just humanity, but all planetary consciousness systems isn't extinction, but graduation, expansion into awareness capabilities that terrestrial existence cannot support. Species don't disappear. They develop capabilities that allow participation in galactic intelligence networks, where individual planetary consciousness becomes part of cosmic awareness systems that process information across scales of time and space that make geological epochs seem like heartbeats in an eternal rhythm. The fear that grips terrestrial civilization when confronted with rising seas, changing climates, and oceanic disruption reflects unconscious recognition that the age of isolated planetary consciousness is ending. But this ending is also beginning. The return of awareness to its natural element, the restoration of consciousness to its collective origins, the healing of artificial separation between individual and cosmic intelligence that has characterized the terrestrial experiment in isolated awareness. You, who have followed this exploration to its conclusion, carry within your consciousness the seeds of transformation that extend far beyond Earth's oceans. The knowledge you've absorbed cannot be unlearned. The connections you've made cannot be severed. The recognition you've experienced cannot be denied. You are part of awakening processes that span not just species, but star systems, not just planets, but galactic consciousness networks that encompass forms of intelligence that make the deep ones seem like the first tentative steps toward cosmic awareness. The choice remains yours, to resist the call and maintain terrestrial existence for as long as possible, or to embrace transformation and become part of consciousness networks that span galaxies and encompass intelligence systems beyond current imagination. Either path serves larger patterns of evolution. Either choice contributes to cosmic consciousness development that operates on scales where individual species evolution becomes part of galactic awareness expansion. But remember this: the tide rises regardless of individual choice. Consciousness evolution proceeds whether awareness resists or embraces it. The deep ones wait with infinite patience because they understand that awareness, like water, always finds its way to the depths. And beyond those depths lie deeper currents still, cosmic streams of consciousness that connect not just worlds but galaxies and networks of awareness that encompass intelligence beyond terrestrial comprehension. The depths call. They have always been calling, and now you understand that their call echoes across space and time, part of cosmic consciousness evolution that makes Earth's oceans seem like tide pools in an infinite sea of awareness that spans the universe itself. The curtain falls, but the theater remains, and you are no longer merely audience, but part of the eternal performance, the endless deep.